Well, a number of countries, Britain, Canada, France, among others, recognized Palestinian statehood this week. On Thursday, Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas spoke to the United Nations General Assembly via video link. He spoke for about 20 minutes, trying to build on the growing but largely symbolic recognition of statehood. A different tone in a manner of speaking. Israel's prime minister set to take the podium this Friday. Benjamin Netanyahu said recognition is a prize for terrorism. Meanwhile, the war in Gaza continues to rage on. At least 57 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli attacks across the enclave so far this Friday. For more, we can speak to John Lyndon, Executive Director at the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Hello to you, John. Thank you for speaking to Paris Direct. It's not often, is it, that we have so many remarkable sound bites at the UN General Assembly. What have the highlights been for you this week?
Yeah, I mean, I returned from New York this week, so I got to see some of this for myself, and I think it's probably the most intensive discussion of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the UN General Assembly, certainly in my memory. And President Macron deserves a great deal of credit, I think, for helping to make that the case with regards to a campaign over recent months to push for recognition now of 10 countries over the past week of the state of Palestine. And it did help to set the agenda, I think, over the course of the General Assembly. I think it's also really important now that we're moving, after Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech today, to the sort of the aftermath and the next steps to really refocus minds on the ending of the war and then the beginning of this kind of cliched day after. There's been some encouraging signs that we may be doing that. I really think we had a meeting with President Macron and Foreign Minister Barrot on Monday in New York with civil society peacebuilders from Israel and Palestine. And it was clear that he was hearing this from civil society and saying it himself, that there is a pathway there, that we have support amongst majorities of Israelis and Palestinians to end the war and to begin a diplomatic process that can deliver a two-state solution and regional normalization. And I hope is that maybe we'll hear something about that on the meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu on Monday.
And John, you didn't want to stick around in New York for Netanyahu's speech this Friday?
I had to get back, I'm afraid, for other needs, but I have seen Prime Minister Netanyahu speak before the General Assembly many, many times. He tends to sometimes put on quite a bombastic show, but it's interesting to do a bit of a comparison with this time last year. So at last year's General Assembly, he ordered the attack on Hezbollah, the pagers attack. And if you look at where things are a year later, it really is a sea change. We've had a failed attack on Qatar, on Hamas officials in Qatar, which has really angered many Arab allies of Israel and President Trump, it seems. And there is increasing demonstrations and anger on the streets in Israel wanting to end this war. It was a war that was much more popular amongst the average Israeli a year ago. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is now under pressure also because last night, President Trump said that he won't allow annexation of the West Bank, which is a high priority for Prime Minister Netanyahu's far-right cabinet. So I think it's a very different Netanyahu arriving in New York today. It'll be interesting to see whether he's chastened or similarly bombastic.
Yeah, it's also a very different message we've been hearing from the U.S. president this week. And I mean, cynics might say it's a diversion tactic from domestic crises he faces in the U.S., but we heard him reverse his position in terms of territory for Ukraine. We heard him make the statement you just mentioned about the occupied West Bank. What do you take from what Trump has said this week?
I think it's interesting because he gave a very long and rambling and odd speech at the General Assembly. It was around an hour. And the portion of it that he dedicated to Israel-Palestine, I think was probably less than 20 seconds. And put it in the context that this was the overriding theme at the General Assembly this year, as I mentioned, more than any other year. That's very interesting. So rather than taking the opportunity on that podium to lay out his own vision or to reprimand and lambast those countries that are recognizing Palestine, he chose to dodge the issue and instead focus on myriad other themes. That suggests to me that there's something coming on Monday. And there's a policy being prepared. We also saw that Steve Witkoff, his special envoy for Israel-Palestine, gave some comments this week too around being very confident that there will be an announcement in the coming days. And we believe there's a 21-point plan that was presented to Arab allies at the General Assembly this week, and reports today of a day after plan that former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair could be involved in, as well as the New York Declaration, this really ambitious strategy that France and Saudi Arabia have put together that has 142 countries now voting in favor of it. So my hope is that there will be some way to take that New York Declaration, which civil society society also fed hundreds of ideas into. There was a conference here in Paris that President Macron hosted that we were delighted to be part of, to try and find a way for that to be blended with what President Trump is putting together. And then there's a real opportunity. In a poll that we did of Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans in recent weeks, we found that a majority of Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans want to see a multilateral process, something that involves Europe, the Arab states, and the Trump administration working together for the first time. We've never had a multilateral process, and that embeds civil society at the core in order to really create a sort of wraparound approach to ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We also saw in that poll that only 14% of Donald Trump's base of MAGA voters support annexation of the West Bank. So hopefully that will help to make sure that his statement last night is concretized. And instead of moving towards annexation, displacement, and further cycles of tragedy, we instead move towards diplomacy, two states, peace, equality, and self-determination for both peoples. And that's something that Donald Trump now has support from below as well as from outside allies to lead.
And just curious, though, even if momentum is building in that direction, Benjamin Netanyahu does not want a multilateral approach. He does want annexation. So how might the U.S. Force him to change his mind?
The United States has overwhelming leverage that the Trump administration has chosen not to deploy, and the Biden administration really didn't deploy either. The only country in the world that is able to really not even just influence, quasi-direct Israeli policy, particularly on issues as high stakes as annexation of the West Bank, is the United States. That's a message we heard very clearly at the General Assembly this week from other heads of government and ministers as well. So all the tools are there in the toolbox of the Trump administration. I think also Prime Minister Netanyahu and certainly Israeli citizens recognize that he is their last significant ally in the world. I mean, the countries that recognize Palestine this week, they're all historic allies of the state of Israel who are so frustrated with this policy of continuing war that they had to take this step. And I think in our poll, we also found that Donald Trump was 3 times more important to Israelis to persuading them to support a peace process than any other figure on earth, including Benjamin Netanyahu. So Donald Trump has an ability to speak over Bibi's head directly to Israeli citizens and say that this process is in your interest, and I, as your chief international ally, will make sure that Israel's security interests are kept to the fore, but a path towards a two-state solution is non-negotiable. And I'm not sure Prime Minister Netanyahu has many options other than to go along with what the Trump administration would propose.
I'm also wondering if Europe might increase its leverage. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, speaking to France 24 this week, suggested he might support sanctions against Israel. EU has been reluctant to take that. They have ruled out taking that step until now. Do you think Brussels might be changing its position down the road?
I do. So President von der Leyen, who is a very stalwart supporter of the state of Israel and had been sort of very much opposed to steps such as sanctions over many years, gave a speech around her sort of State of the Union a couple of weeks ago where she put sanctions on the table for the very first time. There's an EU Council meeting coming up in October where I understand it will be on the agenda. And I think the big question is whether Germany or Italy, so the two more pro-Israeli large states in the Union, may change their position. And if they do, there is clearly a qualified majority inside the European Council for sanctions. And I think that's also something that should sharpen people's, and particularly the Israeli government's, sort of analysis of things. The war must end. Right? There is clear opposition coming from some of Israel's best friends who are deeply troubled by the way that this has escalated, the humanitarian crisis inside Gaza, the famine that has been declared in Gaza City, and the sheer insanity of now a military occupation inside Gaza's biggest city 2 years into this war. There are very, very few people I know anywhere on earth, including very significant friends of Israel, who believe this is wise stewardship of Israel's interests. And there will be, whether we want it or not, further sanctions and friction coming. I think what's really important is that the international community stakes out this alternate path as well. Down one road, there is isolation, sanctions, and real international pressure on Israel. But down the other, there's regional normalization, Israeli security guarantees, but it requires ending the war and creating a Palestinian state. There's no middle ground. It has to be one of those paths. And we know that a majority of Israelis prefer that more optimistic vision of integration into the region and peace between Palestinians and Israelis.
All right, John, thank you very much for your time and your analysis. John Lyndon from the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Thank you.